to say, first of all, welcome to all of you. Thank you for coming out tonight. And also, before we begin, I wanted to wholeheartedly thank the team here at the Collegium, Elspeth, Jennifer, Christy, Mark, and of course, Dieter. We've had some technological snafus today, and they've all really been heroic bringing this event together. And of course, I also want to thank our panelists for agreeing to participate in this conversation, in some cases going well beyond their usual interlocutors, and I'm really grateful for that. I'm especially excited about tonight's event because it's part of our ongoing effort to bring art and research into closer conversation. But what's special here is that it actually requires no effort at all in this case, because art research and a drive toward meaningful social change have always informed and inspired one another in Rick Lowe's work and in his collaborations. We've actually been working with Rick Lowe at the Collegium much longer than I've been around. He has been a visiting fellow here. He is a project leader for a collaborative research project that began here called the Black Wall Street Journey, which we'll be learning more about tonight if you don't know about it already. And that project was also part of the MacArthur Foundation's multi-sited exhibition Toward Common Cause, which we also participated in here at the Collegium. So a lot of things are coming together here tonight. Finally, of course, we're extremely proud to be exhibiting Rick's paintings in our gallery right now. And if you haven't already had a chance to see them, of course, the gallery will be open after the event, and I hope you'll take the time to visit this evening. We've assembled a really fantastic panel here today, which will be responding to and contextualizing Rick's work from a variety of vantage points, including economics, sociology, and history, as well as contemporary art. In terms of the format, I'm going to briefly introduce all of the panelists in the order that they will speak. Each of them will have 5 to 10 minutes to speak. I am going to be timing them with my iPhone and cutting them off if they go beyond 10 minutes, because I think we all are going to have so much to say. And finally, we'll give Rick an opportunity to respond. I won't time him. And then hopefully open the floor to your questions and comments. So without further ado, our first speaker will be Dieter Rollstrasse, who many of you already know. He's our fabulous curator here at the Neubauer Collegium, and he'll be providing a bit more, introduce Rick and his work a bit more fully to you all. Second, we'll be hearing from Derek Neal, an economist here at the University of Chicago. His research focuses on issues related to labor economics, Black-white wage inequality, the economics of crime, and education policy. Our second speaker on the panel will be Adam Green from the Department of History and our new Department of Race, Diaspora, and Indigeneity here at the University of Chicago. His focus is 20th century African-American history, including the history of Black Chicago. And among his many roles, he's also recently served on the City of Chicago's Advisory Committee on Monuments and Memorials, and is currently a member of the Council on New Chicago Community Relations. Then we'll be hearing from Kate Cagney. She's director of the University of Michigan's Institute for Social Research and previously was here at the University of Chicago. Professor Cagney's work examines social inequalities and its relationship to health with a focus on neighborhood, race, and aging. And the life force, and she is a collaborator on the Black Wall Street Journey project. And finally, as I said, we'll give Rick a chance to respond. But to start, Dieter, you're up first. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Tara. We are not looking at anything on screens today, are we? Right?
Oh, I forgot.
Yeah, no, just so there will be some materials that will be discussed, and I think that these will be handed out, right?
I think many of you have handouts already.
Right, okay, excellent, okay. So I like it when the speakers agree with the curatorial creed that the art should speak for itself, or that, you know, the painting should come, the reading. So thank you for coming tonight, January 18th. Trying to remember whose birthday it is because I can't just come up with anything right now. So we're here today to talk about the art of Rick Lowe, or rather to respond to the exhibition of Rick Lowe's work currently on view in the Neubauer Collegium Gallery, and I'll follow Tara in the recommendation. Of course, if you haven't seen the exhibition yet, of course, make sure that you do so after this event concludes. In fact, I hope you've seen it already, otherwise it will feel a little bit strange to be talking about the work in the detail that we'll be talking about. The exhibition is up until the 10th of February, so this is in a way a closing event of sorts, right? Certainly not the end of the story of our ongoing relationship with Rick, who will be a frequent visitor to return to Chicago in the next months, years. I'll be brief in introducing Rick, primarily because he's the variety of artists who doesn't need an introduction. And I like that. It's always my favorite part of introducing artists when they don't need introductions. And I've gotten very good at working with artists who don't need introductions. Though that's, of course, somewhat arrogant to assume that everyone would know what he's doing. But I wanted to be brief because, of course, I'm very keen to hear what our panelists have prepared in response to his exhibition. So ever so briefly, a MacArthur Foundation Fellowship recipient in 2014, Rick Lowe has long been widely known as a pioneer of the social practice paradigm in art. One of the best known examples of which remains Project Row Houses, which he co-founded in Houston in the early 1990s. Houston is where Rick lives and works to this day. It's his adopted hometown, not where he's originally from, which I'm sure we'll hear about today. And it is Rick's track record in this particular field of socially engaged, community-rooted art practice, which led to his inclusion in the exhibition Toward Common Cause, Art, Social Change, and the MacArthur Fellows Program at 40, which was organized across Chicago in 2021, for which he developed the ongoing art and research project, Black Wall Street Journey, about which I'm sure we'll also be talking tonight. And in fact, it was the Black Wall Street Journey project initiated by Rick in collaboration with Abigail Winograd, which first led to Rick's appointment as a fellow here at the Neubauer Collegium. So that's where that history starts. Am I already out of time?
No,
Okay,
sorry.
no. Anyway, so Rick, again, a pioneer of the social practice paradigm in art. However, if you've seen the show, you will have noticed that there are paintings. It is important to note that Rick was initially trained as a painter, in fact, landscape painting first and foremost. And, you know, I'm talking now about his formative years as an art student in the early 80s, that would be. And of course, it's interesting to think about this work shown here, made in 2022, shown here in 2022 and 2023, reaching across this 40-year divide back to this kind of foundational root in a way of the idea of landscape. And it is, in fact, in recent years that he has increasingly returned to painting to better process the finding of 3 decades worth of work in the social realm. I just actually today wrapped up a 5,000-word essay about Rick's work for an upcoming monograph to be co-published by the Neubauer Collegium and the Guggen Gallery in New York. And that's a little bit kind of the main point I'm making in my essay, that, you know, he's kind of returned to painting to better meditate on the legacy in a way of his work in the social realm. The paintings on view in the gallery, gathered under the overarching title Notes on the Great Migration, in some sense act as reflections upon this rich legacy of socially engaged work. But they also, as their title obliquely suggests, come out of the research that has helped define the Black Wall Street Journey project to date, a journey that historically has so often been the story of south to north migration. And the story, moreover, and now I'm going to get a little enigmatic and technical, and kind of, you know, preparing the panel. It's a story, moreover, that Rick has chosen to tell in part through the visual medium of the domino stone, about which I'm sure we will likewise hear more this evening. So on the fittingly enigmatic note of the domino stone, I am honored to pass the proverbial mic to Derek Neal, the economist at the University of Chicago, here his thoughts in response to Rick's project. Thank you.
So I'm not playing with my phone. I have a stopwatch here. And I'm going to look at it so I don't get embarrassed and cut off. The economics department at the University of Chicago, either through its faculty members or its graduate students that went on to be faculty everywhere elsewhere, produced most of the important economic scholarship about the quantitative evidence concerning Black progress in the late 19th century and through the 20th century into now. And there's a long list of people who worked on it. I've taught graduate classes on it. 9 out of 10 things that are worth reading, the author has some Chicago connection. And so what I'm going to do here today is to talk about that legacy of research, quantitative research, and how it interacts with the art, and specifically the Great Migration. And the Great Migration and the time series of the Great Migration is kind of a linchpin in a very important argument among social scientists that went on from the mid-70s up until the early 90s, when I believe that James Heckman just, ended it by settling the question. And the argument was the following: did the Civil Rights Act in 1964 and then its implementation in 1965, was that something that moved Black Americans forward in a unique and discrete way, or was the passage of that act just a part of a social trend? America was becoming less filled with racial strife, and the passing of the law just was evidence that America was ready to accept change. Richard Epstein in our law school, who's no longer on the law school faculty, but was for many years, he was the proponent of the latter view, and he was wrong. And Jim Heckman, if you read the competing articles and books, Jim just really beat him down with evidence. And one of the linchpins of Jim's evidence was that the Great Migration stopped in 1965. There's just mountains of evidence, but the key thing is 60 to 65, the Great Migration in terms of the flow from the south to the north is as robust as it had ever been. And it's a trickle after 65, and by the 70s, it's reversing. And in the 90s, the reversal is a tide coming back the other direction. And so I want to make a few observations about this that are in your handout. The first is that the linchpin of Jim's argument is that the Civil Rights Act was imposed upon the South. And one of the reasons that it had such effect was there was long-standing occupational segregation policies in manufacturing in the South, some enforced by local laws, more enforced by not so veiled threats from the Klan and other organizations of white workers that if you hire Blacks in these jobs, we might burn down the factory. Okay? But with the Civil Rights Act and the executive orders about affirmative action, the feds are coming in and saying everyone has to do it at once. And it's one of those things, if everyone does it at once, they can't burn down all the factories. And so the federal government broke a discriminatory social equilibrium that had held African Americans out of jobs that they could well do. This really, I've thought a lot about this. My grandfather, who worked in those cotton mills, and a lot of them are between where Rick was born and where I was born. he said, blacks could have learned those jobs. I only had a third grade education, but they were never allowed to do anything but sweep the grease racks and sweep the floors. And that ended in 1965. And so I think, going forward, it would be nice to find a way to incorporate into the art some image of what manufacturing looks like in these areas, because a lot as blacks came back from the North, a lot of the manufacturing jobs came back with them. There's a Kia plant about halfway between where we grew up that you can see from space, and there's no barring of blacks from having those jobs. The other thing that I want people to think about is, in what ways did the northern cities fail African Americans that led to the reversal? And one of the things I point to in the handout is that there's a group of education researchers, Grismer and Flanagan, and they pointed out that in 1995, in the NAEP data, the scores for African American children in northern cities were lower than for African American children in the rural South. Now, if you know anything about the history of the way that schooling was denied to rural blacks in the first half of the century, read about the history of the Rosenwald schools that were built by our Rosenwald to try to address that problem. It is stunning that 3 decades after the Civil Rights Act, there could be that problem. Now, the decades since, we have seen great, Sean Reardon at Stanford Ed School has shown there's been great progress in the last 2 decades in the quality of urban schools, and we should all be thankful for that. However, to be personal about this, I do volunteer work with a group that works with ex-offenders, trying to get them the skills they need to pass the test to get in the training programs for the trade unions. And I have sat with young men who are 28, who grew up in Chicago, and I try to give them problems they might encounter working in these jobs. Like, if your truck gets 20 miles to the gallon and you have to drive to Detroit, and it's 240 miles to Detroit, and you have to come back, and you've got this many gallons and this many in the tank, how much gas do you need to put in the truck so that you know you'll get back? And uniformly, these young men are incapable. And so we often get confused with college. It's very hard to do the well-paying blue-collar jobs if we don't improve the education that we give a lot of young men. And this is where, I'll stop. I want to push back against the Black Wall Street focus. Most of the payments in the national income accounts go to labor. Most of the literature that I bragged about that is the legacy of our department is about the access that African Americans had to schooling that would allow them to acquire skills, and then the access they had in the labor market to jobs that would allow them to use their skills. And the vast majority of people hold almost all of their wealth in terms of their ability to be productive. And so as we think about the future of this effort, I think we want to think about the history of social change or lack of social change that has affected the capacity of people to acquire skills and choose what they want to do in life and be paid for doing what they want to do in life. And I think those issues were central for why we had the Great Migration in one direction. And and I think that's been shown and proven. And I think in future decades will show that it was also central in terms of why it reversed and people came the other way. And I just hit 10 minutes and 5 seconds.
Okay, well, that's going to be tough to follow, not least of which because you were on time, Derek. Let's see what got it right. First of all, it's great to take part in this panel. It's really special and an honor to be able to speak to your work, Rick, and I'm looking forward to the conversation that comes after this. Maybe I'll start with a story since Peter brought up the dominoes issue and sort of speaking to that when I came down here to talk about taking part in the panel and saw the work for the first time, one of the things that I was struck by was the way in which the use of dominoes and dollars and other sorts of pieces to kind of create a collage effect as well as a sense of kind of deep relief, almost spatial in terms of thinking about territory being brought up, was that slow was the word rather than fast in terms of thinking about what the painting suggested around the ways in which people made their ways to these different destinations, the ways in which people came to an understanding of the meaning of their life after migration. And for me as a historian, that really corresponds, it correlates with the ways in which people sometimes take multiple generations to make sense of the impact, the value, the correctness of that decision to go someplace else, to invest in a certain sense in different kinds of ideas of what might come from their life. And I think that that's really the motivation for the slides. We're not showing that I have in the photocopy as the first slide, which is to really encourage, invite us as a group to think about migration, wealth creation, freedom movements as exercises that can be understood and assessed in relation to thinking about their processes rather than their outcomes. Outcomes are very important, and I think that that's one of the things that Derek was stressing in relation to thinking about how we understand the impact of legal reform, for instance, in relation to employment opportunities. And I don't want to say that we shouldn't bring those into the conversation, but sometimes the journey actually constitutes the destination on its own. And I think that migration is always, including return migration, something that we want to think about in relation to processes. And so I think if there's anything that I'm suggesting in terms of this conversation and anything that I'm resonating around it, it's the importance of thinking about the ways in which this reminds us of people becoming. That's important in terms of thinking about the value of those processes, rather than what impact, what change, what transformation may have taken place and may be credited or assessed at the end, important though that is. So I think that what I wanted to also contribute was both an acknowledgement of the importance of trying to identify, trying to represent, trying to interpret, and perhaps even trying to advocate and celebrate sort of instances of advancing Black wealth of the sort that Black Wall Street, the sort of famed district within Tulsa that was targeted in the race riot of 1922, really a kind of deliberate genocidal act, both in terms of attacking people on their body, but also tellingly in terms of trying to eradicate everything that had been put together in the form of an infrastructure of community, which after all is another facet of what we understand to constitute genocide according to international law. That this is something that I think we need to think about in terms of what it yielded. And I'm going to make a few suggestions about this in relation to Chicago, but also for the sake of the conversation and discussion, and I think future work for all of us in different sorts of ways, to raise some cautions in relation to investing, as it were, too much in the idea of Black wealth as a panacea. I think in that sense, in a somewhat oblique way, I'm coming back to the conclusion that Derek came to at the end of his presentation. I included a couple of images. One of them is from the page on Black, or the chapter on Black business that St. Clair Drake and Horace Caton in their famous and landmark book, still very relevant, Black Metropolis, wrote in terms of trying to characterize Black business. And I think that's just to kind of provide a graphic and a data representation of what we're talking about in terms of the aggregate space of African-American businesses during this period. I believe it's like somewhere between 1,300 to approaching close to 2,000 between the mid-1920s and the late 1930s during the Depression. I mean, one of the things that reminds us is that we're not talking about something that comprises the pursuits and the endeavors of the majority of the community. Most people were workers then, as is the case now. The split between service and production or retail or professional sorts of activities is interesting and important to think about as well. And certainly in Chicago, as was the case in Tulsa and most other places, this yielded almost a kind of identity in terms of these communities. And so the slides that you would see at the end, the image of Annie Turnbull Malone, the entrepreneur based in St. Louis who moved to Chicago in 1930, not only to start the Poro beauty network that began to move cosmetics around, but more importantly, started a beauty college that trained beauticians that went into salons, barbershops, went into sort of early areas in terms of manufacturing beauty products all across Chicago and through the Midwest, which was really an epicenter to some degree of that trade. Next to her is Anthony Overton, who, if you go past 35th and State, you see the Overton building today with the library underneath it. That was one of the kind of capital districts in what was then the center of Black Chicago back in the 1920s and 1930s. And then finally, I want to remind myself, we have Robert Sangstack Abbott, who founded The Defender, which is a newspaper, is an important sort of circuit and node of information, but was also a business and a pretty successful one in terms of the ways in which it grounded activities in community. And I think those are to be celebrated. But on the other side are the majority of the businesses that existed in the Black community. And here I'm setting up something in terms of speaking about contemporary conditions that were much more modest. Businesses that, for instance, were cleaners, like the Pekin Cleaners on 35th and State, also rather famous in relation to Robert Pekin being one of the more important African-American entrepreneurs. He had a theater that Louis Armstrong and a number of other jazz musicians played at all through the 20s. Or the dry goods businesses, which were many of the ones that African-Americans had that might sell coal or wood or ice or sodas during this period. Or, of course, the beauty shop on the side there. Many of the businesses that we're talking about were actually modest businesses like this. And we were speaking yesterday about the ways in which that's also the case in terms of thinking about Tulsa and other areas. And I think that raises some points about understanding the character of what it means to talk about increasing and establishing and generating the conditions for Black wealth, leaving aside wages and what it is that people have in terms of household income. And that raises a few cautions in my mind. One, wealth clearly is something that is the yield and the outcome of initiative, entrepreneurship, ingenuity, perseverance, maybe even genius. But wealth is also the outcome of concentration. And it means that when we're talking about wealth, we're talking about bringing resources in close, usually in a single person's hands. And so distribution is an important challenge in terms of thinking about how wealth creation benefits a larger community. A problem, of course, that has come up again and again in terms of speaking about Black business, Black private sector activity, in terms of the well-being of communities more generally. I think also second, wealth and well-being are certainly linked, but also are not identical. And creating the distinctions between what gives people a sense of fulfillment in their lives that's not indexed by material increase, not indexed by material resources, enhancement, stability, richness of family life, the capacity to share in cultural work, the sense that you're increasing capacity and capabilities in the sorts of ways that the economist Amartya Sen or the ethicist and legal scholar Marcia Nussbaum often speak about in terms of a capabilities approach to how we think about community enhancement and development. These, I think, are important in terms of understanding what is the well-being that's behind wealth. And then finally, wealth once achieved may seem enduring. It may seem, when millions and millions are made, that it will be there for all time. But oftentimes that proves not to be the case. And that, of course, is the provenance of the last slide that I have here. Two of the most important business people in the history of Chicago are John H. Johnson and Jesse Binga. And I think both of their stories are interesting to consider in terms of the impermanence of wealth. Johnson, which coincidentally, I didn't know that I had access to this, is represented by this forever stamp that came out in 2012. The very next year, Johnson Publishing, 7 years before it was actually liquidated in 2019, and 7 years after his death, first began to be spun off and disaggregated, and publications of the magazines began to cease, which resulted in a death spiral in relation to the company that I think was close to scores, if not perhaps even something approaching $100 million in relation to what was actually being generated. And then second, Jesse Binga is maybe even more of a cautionary tale. This was someone who, as the picture depicts, had bank buildings, had a 5-story arcade in the 1920s, and yet by the 1930s, when his bank failed, he was prosecuted for consumer fraud, put in prison, only sort of brought out after a long campaign involving community support, and worked menial jobs for the rest of his life to 1950. So I think that when we think about wealth as something to represent and interpret and celebrate, we want to keep those cautions in mind in relation to understanding that they are an important engine, but they are not the be-all and end-all in relation to the ways in which communities develop. And I know that that's something that's a very important component of the outreach and the engagement and the partnerships that have happened so far with this project, which I hope there'll be some opportunity to talk about. But I think that that should be part of our conversation. Thank you.
Really love Adam's notion of wealth and well-being, and that will emerge as I describe some of our data collection through the voices of some of our respondents in our qualitative component of research effort. So I've entitled this my few brief moments today, the Black Wall Street Data Journey, because we really came together as a team to think about how data could be brought to bear to understand wealth and inequality in contemporary lens. And I want to acknowledge Jennifer Entian, Rick, Joshua Silver, who's in the back of the room, and Abby, of course, as members of our team, and really helped to both develop the questions that I'll describe and to think about the interpretation of the data. So I'm going to rely a bit more on these because the very small version, turns out I can't read anymore. So just want to take you through a quick overview. What we know right now, and as I said, we're taking on a contemporary lens. We've observed economic stagnation in many Black communities with efforts to enliven, often not seeming to have a long-term impact. And I think really drawing out some of the observations that Adam just shared. So how can something like social sculpture, I'm going to define that in a moment, lead to engagement and potentially economic investment? And this is what I think Rick will draw out later in our conversation. How do we convey different information on what has been a signifier of inequality, and in this case is the ticker, that many of you are now aware of and saw at Smart Museum. Really, how can we harness data, both found data, so sometimes we call it big data, but data that exists that we can scrape, and data produced by residents. How can that alter economic well-being of a community? So let me tell you a little bit about sociology and social sculpture. So we want to draw on these symbolic dimensions of Black Wall Street, advancing community-based strategies for reconceptualizing Black wealth. Sociologists have frequently studied public art in relationship to outcomes like gentrification and placemaking, but really, I would argue, have neglected to explicitly theorize or empirically examine really the genre of community-based art practice known as social sculpture. And I know Rick has been in conversation with that literature from the 60s and 70s. Joseph Beuys, right, a German sculptor who would ask how would we mold and shape the world in which we live, and really thought about sort of art and practice. So I wanted to discuss that with Rick. And that really eschews definitions of art as a product, really favoring an understanding of art as a community process. And then there's the explicit framing of art projects as efforts to address historical injustices. And we found this useful through action rather than through commemoration or representation. And there is the sociologist Heim, who is one of the few sociologists really taken on this notion of social sculpture. really hoping to stimulate conversation through what he describes as slow activism. And so I was reminded of that when you were throwing out the idea of slow. So what did we do? How did we think about creating data that could help describe what is going on in our adjacent communities? So we focus on Washington Park primarily, and those are the quotes I'm going to draw on today. There were really 3 rounds of interviewing, and in the piece that I will describe, we wanted to draw on residents' perceptions of the kinds of questions we wanted to ask. So first, we got some kind of conceptual feedback, I would say, from all of our colleagues in terms of the kinds of questions we wanted to ask. We then engaged in what survey professionals would describe as cognitive interviewing, so sort of in-depth conversation about how people react to the questions. And then we went on to modify as we read the transcripts and came up with various ideas. We really wanted to focus too on making certain we understood how people perceived wealth and inequality in their neighborhoods. So, and I would say too that we really wanted to take on a multi-pronged approach, multidisciplinary approach to how we develop these questions. So I just wanted to share a few quotes, and I want to also give a shout out to Joshua, who did some of this key interviewing. We asked about overall impressions of the kinds of questions we wanted to ask about neighborhood, community, trust, and solidarity. So one of our respondents said some questions were relevant, some weren't. Questions about promise of opportunities and jobs. He said State Street used to be one of the main economic sources of the community. It would generate food, education opportunities, fitness opportunities. Now it's barren. He's looking for that same type of economic opportunity to create jobs. He's at 59th and Wabash. He says the community fought hard to keep the store despite illegal activity coming out of it. So it had sort of multi-purpose, right, activity. Didn't want to close it because it's the only store in the neighborhood, only place to get groceries, milk, eggs. That was really conflicting for him. He's looking for more. What's coming? What do we need? Drugstore, Walgreens, grocery stores. So he wanted many more questions about how we change the neighborhood. He believes it's coming around better than it used to be, but you need more opportunity. He said the university wants the land, but we need businesses now. If they come with the expansion of the U of C, they're not for us. But if they come before us, then it is for us. I'll share a second respondent when we asked, please share what you like most about the neighborhood where you currently live. This respondent said, it depends on what neighborhood. If you're going to ask that in Washington Park, you might get a lot of negativity. Things are gone. There's a strip mall, lots of places to shop. They might say they're doing okay. The only thing that's up and thriving are 2 restaurants. Miss Lee's is gone. Now there's a supper club. It was thriving back in the day. It had the jazz clubs and the bakery, but that's gone. Vacant lots on King, and hopefully that'll be built up. But there aren't jobs now. We used to thrive with stores and nightclubs and restaurants. And finally, I'll just share what are the overall impressions of the kinds of questions we wanted to ask. And our respondents really focused on things like beautification. I want to teach kids how to grow their own food and plant flowers. It would cut down on the violence. One of the other respondents said, if you could add one thing to your community, what would it be? Wants us to ask that because we're talking about Black wealth and ownership. It takes a vision to create these things. So you have to add that. It's also a positive note to end on. So good voice. So we called all these data. We partnered with the National Opinion Research Center. Make your voices heard. So if this was a screen, you would see what the screen would look like on your iPhone. If anybody wants to take the survey, we can send it to you. And I'll just say quickly, we asked some key questions. We asked what we describe as pro-social questions comes from collective efficacy theory, sort of contemporary elaborations of old Chicago school theory about trust and solidarity and community, social and physical disorder, extent to which you feel somebody has your back in community. So we asked those key questions. But then we asked more, and this was something Rick really wanted to draw about economic viability in the community. So again, we asked things, this is a close-knit neighborhood. You can see on your handout, people of different races spend time together in this neighborhood. I'm going to get back to that in a moment. Overall, how much impact do you think people like you can have in making the community a better place to live? Are there barriers that keep people in your community from getting ahead financially? If so, what are they? How important do you think it is to shop in your neighborhood? So you can sort of see some of these ones in your handout. But one of the things I really wanted to emphasize as we're asking these questions is to think about how residents operate in space. And again, if we had a bigger screen, I would show this slide. So you can see, you might want to pull this up, created by Nia Kai, who's in the back of the room. Why this slide is important, it shows 10 key Chicago neighborhoods. This comes from our study called Chicago Health and Activity Space in Real Time. And what it illustrates briefly is that our days are as segregated as our nights. So where we spend time during the day tends to look like the neighborhood in which we live. So we even have some data for people who are accessing healthcare, who will hopscotch, who will be in Washington Park. They don't spend time in Hyde Park. They'll go to Englewood for things like dialysis care. So what is it about a composition of community that draws people out? And why do people bypass potentially amenity-rich spaces? So that's one of the key questions we want to ask in our adjacent study. But I think it's important to think about how people operate in space as we ask these questions about wealth, proximity, and inequality. And I will close by saying, what are the roles of other social forces? Thinking about how people secure amenities in a very racialized manner. And then we're thinking about doing some comparative work in maybe Detroit. And that is my hope next. And I'll close there and have you speak.
Thank you. Well, I have to start, I just want to thank a couple of people. Thank Peter for curating the exhibition. Really great to be in this, to bring that part of my work to this conversation. And then these distinguished scholars here, which is you know, it's always interesting for someone like myself who work very intuitively to sit in the context of people that work from a more scientific, you know, perspective. And so so my contribution here will not be from notes and stuff, you know, and all kind of planned out. I'm just going to kind of ramble through like I'm in conversation with folks here. I won't necessarily respond specifically to each of you, but I will. There are parts you'll hear your part in some of my comments here. But I also want to you know, thank the Neubauer Collegium for standing unwaveringly with me on this process for so long, and then Abigail, who has been my collaborator here, and you know, we're excited to see where this thing goes. But let me just kind of say some of the things that that spurred this whole thing along for me. And it comes from a set of kind of conflicting ideas or thoughts, right? I mean, you know, if we look at data and we think about what the data says, and you know, and Derek pulls so much of that information out about data, and the data is what's real, right? I mean, that's the real stuff. I mean, you can look at it and you can see it. But there's also the conflicting thing, though, is that there's a side of kind of how people perceive things too. You know, there's the perception of things, and I always had this. For me, this project, you know, comes about because, you know, the data shows all the challenges that Black communities have, you know, throughout the country, that we lag behind economically in so many ways, right? So that's what the data says. But there are also windows that I can walk into and I can see so much hope and prosperity, you know, that there's real stuff happening here. And so how do we, you know, how do we balance that out, you know, in terms of creating a narrative? How do we talk about, you know, what the possibility and the economic sustainability and flourishing of Black communities within these two different conflicting ways of seeing things? I also think there's, you know, I like to call it, you know, it is the, you know, the data folks, it's about the real, you know, it's the real stuff, but there's perceptive stuff. And you know, and Adam, you know, part of what, you know, my thinking, what I've kind of got from talking to you over the last couple of days, this notion about process is that, you know, if we just wait and we look at the end result, we miss so much stuff that happens in between. And those things that happen in between that that has potential to tell a different story. You know, it may not provide us with, you know, a kind of an end result, but it can give us some other things, because what we're looking at, and whenever anybody's telling a story, as an artist, you're making work that it may not all be true, but you're trying to find the part that can inspire. You know, that's the whole point, right? It's like, you want to be able to inspire people beyond what might be the actual, you know, and that's a big part of that. And but as Kate, you know, working with Kate over the last, you know, couple of years, we found though that, you know, and actually, you know, Derek put this up a little bit too, you know, in our conversation yesterday about the challenges. How do you get data, and how do you actually use it in a way in which it can actually alter some of the perceptions that we have, even though, you know, there's, you know, I'm always, you know, I'm thinking about this, and it's relevant to, you know, African Americans, but I also, in my just thinking about this all the time, brought this up the other day about, even if we think of the continent of Africa, you know, I mean, you know, the narrative around the continent of Africa is one of, you know, third world, right? But we also know there's another side of it. There's an incredible amount of, you know, resources there. And some people know it. China knows it, right? And there are people that are building upon that, but it's not, but the narrative has not kind of made it into the conversations in the lives of how Black communities use resources that are available to kind of switch that narrative a little bit from one of deficit. And you know, and when Kate, her last comment there was about, you know, this idea of trying to do some comparative work. It was interesting because one of the things I kept saying, the thing that you know, I'm not a researcher, I'm not a scholar, that's not my world, but I you know, I live in a world and I think about it and I have these questions, you know. And so, you know, and I was thinking about it, and I was thinking how whenever you Google things about Black wealth, Black economic, Black, you know, sustainability stuff, we always get a deficit because it's measured against the overall, it's measured against whites, right? And as Derek said, if you do that, you're looking at these outcomes, but you're missing the process. You're missing the process of how some communities may be doing really well, you know, and there are certain sectors that are, some that are not. And so we started talking about this, is that maybe one of the things that we need to be doing is trying to figure out how we can measure and compare, like, you know, communities. You know, so, you know, there are places in the, you know, Bronzeville or south side of Chicago that may have some similarities to places in Detroit. And, you know, you start kind of looking at things here and seeing how those move in a more relative way, as opposed to trying to, you know, kind of look at it in this broad, you know, very objective kind of, you know, scenario. So for me, you know, sitting here with you all, it's like this great opportunity for me to just kind of listen to you and push you, you know, because I think that's one of the things that I found, you know, is that, you know, I said this the other day, I said, from my novice, just kind of looking around, there's so little information about the more hopeful sides of, you know, African American economics, and I say, well, that's either because, you know, there's just no interest in it, you know, that nobody's thought that it was worthy, to speak about that, or to do research about that or whatever. Or that maybe the way of gathering that information is just too complex. And I think that's what, Derek, that was your comment, was that it's challenging to be able to pull that out, you know, and get the kinds of things that I'm looking for, which is one that, you know, a young person on, on 68th Street or wherever, on the south side of Chicago, can go to school and understand that there are broad economic possibilities in their life. I mean, one of the basketball player, Charles Barkley, told this story. He said, like, when he goes to speak to high schools, he go to majority white schools, and he asks people, what do you want to be when you grow up? People have all kinds of things they dream of doing. Maybe 10% will say something about sports or entertainment. And he goes to black school, and it's the reverse. It's at 90%, because that window, I mean, that, what's the perceived opportunities are so narrow. And I think so much of that has to do with, what kind of information we're getting from the level of research, but also, how it's making its way, into the world as just general information. And I'm going to stop with that to just also go back to Derek, your thing about, which I thought was really an interesting comment about this, that you published in The Economist and Jet magazine in the same month, which is kind of interesting to me, right? Because that kind of speaks to this idea of like, okay, so there is the, there's the hard, kind of scholarly, information, but then there's also, Jet, who's not dealing with that kind of stuff. They're just dealing with what the perceived thing, what's going to help kind of with the perception of Black culture, Black life. And how do we get there? And so Adam, you talked about that process. So how do we we find ways to use the work that you all do that can start to kind of, as Kate said, alter, how it's used for the benefit of, the overall perception of Black possibilities in economics.
Should I?
Yeah.
I think one thing is to start by identifying bridges like that, and the apparent incongruity, but underneath it are probably some stories. I don't want to present myself as an expert in terms of Johnson Publishing in the 1980s or 70s or 90s. Most of what I did in terms of my research was 40s and 50s, but Johnson Publishing had a library. And Doris Saunders, who came out of the library system here in Chicago, took pains to make sure that there was a great deal of material for the writers who were working in Johnson Publishing to work from in developing their stories. She may have had contacts to the economics department at that time to be able to say, this is interesting research that Professor Neal is doing, and it ought to be put before readers there. There are economists like Andrew Grimmer and others who had also established, I think, something of a record in relation to the general Black population around bringing that knowledge. But I appreciate the question and push, as you put it, because I think it reminds us that we want to go back to the bridge of making it possible for that knowledge to migrate outside of the academy to other areas. And I think that says to me, it's something that's come up a few times in conversations with some of my colleagues in the council, that scholarship and wisdom are connected, but they're not necessarily the same thing. And that sometimes wisdom is something that can actually, have a connection to scholarship, but oftentimes actually reveals the ways in which it can be useful in everyday life.
Yeah, actually, you all did such a great job keeping time. I was going to invite, if anybody wants to ask a question, if you want to ask questions of each other. But.
So I just wanted to say one word, because the word concentration came up in your remarks.
Guilty as charged.
And it's important because, but what we usually think about there's this mining town in West Virginia and one company owns all of the resources and then the labor is exploited, and that's real. We need to be equally concerned about concentration in the public sector, because every study that has ever shown, here's this group of kids and they benefit greatly from having some private alternative to their local public school. Every study, the kids involved are African-American kids that live in a big city. There's no evidence that vouchers or charters does anything for white folks in the suburb. They've got plenty of choices. And, you know, people don't realize it, but, you know, Steve Raudenbush and Lisa Rosen and some others here evaluated the U of C charter schools. They're the best schools in the world. I mean, they took in, when they started, they took in a group of mostly underprivileged African-American kids, like 90%. By the time those kids were in 7th grade, they were pretty much at the average achievement level in Illinois. They came very close to eliminating the Black-white achievement gap in 7 years. And they didn't do it by working them to death. They started early. They had a program that worked. Now, I want to add this caveat. I wrote a book called Information Incentives and Education Policy. It is not easy to design the alternative program that says we're going to give choice to these parents in these traditionally disadvantaged neighborhoods. We're going to do reparations by saying if you lived in an area that was historically just, you know, redlined, historically oppressed, we're going to give you a voucher. That's what it's very hard to then set up the public agency that decides what schools are good enough that they can receive a voucher. What we're going to inspect the schools and make sure they're actually over the long haul providing a good education. And so it's a lot of work, even when you identify that there can be problems with public concentration, coming up with the system that gives disadvantaged communities choices other than the traditional public option, but you make sure the public funds that are paying for those options actually give them better options. And so the devil's in the details in this. And the last thing I'll say, your point about wealth was very poignant to me, because I came to this campus and right in the middle of it is Rosenwald Hall. And Julius Rosenwald made a lot of money running Sears, did a lot to help African-American people in the South get real schools. And in 1991, my dad became a displaced worker because he had worked for Sears for 40 years. And last year, they closed the last Sears store in Illinois. And no one in their right mind could have dreamed in 1970 that Sears would disappear. And so it's true for, you know, the guy, we put his name on the building here, and it's just a fact of life that these things don't last forever.
You know,
No, please respond. Yeah.
yeah, okay, so, you know, Derek, earlier you were talking, you kind of pushed a little bit on the Black Wall Street idea. And, you know, I think a lot of times, and you were very, obviously right in the data, you know, that, you know, Black wealth was not like something that was up here. It was, and 70% of the people that were doing work, that we're working, for those resources, right? And that's true. But then when you're talking about the charter school thing, it's almost like flip it a little bit. Because then, charter schools, I mean, you have this kind of elite, you're investing resources in the smaller sector as opposed to the public sector where there's going to be the broader number of people that we expect to kind of go into the world and work and generate.
The successes are going to the communities where, this is the way I always explain it, and this is what was in JET, because I was one of the first to say that in terms of these scholarship programs in the 70s that gave people access to Catholic schools, it was African Americans in the cities that benefited from getting that access. And I wrote this paper when I was running a tutoring program in Woodlawn. And I was trying my best to get the local 6th grade math teacher to give me a curriculum sheet so that I could follow up with Scooter in 6th grade math, because we had finally, made it on 5th grade math. And I couldn't get a response. I even got stationery from the church office and said, I'm a professor at the university, run the tutoring program at the church around the corner. Crickets. At the same time, the Flossmoor Public Schools hired a superintendent that brought in a weaker math curriculum, and it took 6 months for the business school faculty to organize, win an election, take over the school board, and fire the guy. And they were completely transforming this little suburban public school district while I was just trying to get a curriculum sheet. But you know what? They didn't fix the potholes in Woodlawn, and the ambulances didn't come when you called, and the police were kind of slow, and I guarantee you the fire trucks didn't show up as well. And what I'm saying is we have to realize that in large cities where there are these big behemoths that provide public services, it's the poor communities that get the worst service. And we need to think about, and it's not easy. My whole book is about, it's easy to identify the problem. It's hard to come up with a better alternative. But we need to realize that these large city organizations, whether it's the housing authorities, the CTA, when is the red line actually going to extend south? I don't know. But there's and there were 130 private schools that were open during COVID and having in-class learning and didn't have the learning loss. I mean, we just have to realize that concentration of the provision of services to disadvantaged communities in large city organizations can also be a problem. And we need to think about ways to have better choices. I mean, the most clear thing in the economics research is Section 8 housing and housing vouchers is much better for disadvantaged residents than big public housing units run by city housing authorities. It doesn't matter what period of time, what city you do the evaluation, who did it. Everybody always gets the same answer. What those big things like Robert Taylor homes just don't work. They didn't, and so I just think that as long as we're going to talk about concentration is very dangerous in the private sector. It's also very dangerous for disadvantaged communities in the public sector, but it's not easy to fix.
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to get back to the question of how to think about what's, coming up from the ground. I think one caveat with this, I know there's several people in the audience who know a great deal in terms of thinking about housing, the transformation in relation to public housing. One of the things that I think is an obstacle is you can create that data by studying the people who report back to you. But one of the things that's been proven in terms of the last 10 years around the transition away from public housing is that a lot of people aren't getting captured by generating knowledge, generating data points in terms of what their lives are, whether it's homelessness, whether it's questions in relation to stress and dropout from school. So that's a place where I think the data is empirical, but empirical doesn't necessarily mean that it's the whole truth. And, I think in a sense, we're all sort of trying to find a way to put our hands around the elephant to figure out what it is that we're actually looking at.
Yeah, as you were speaking, I was looking at my colleague, who's here, who can say a lot, and hopefully you'll chime in about sampling and how one, right, sort of deals with a circumstance in which you're able to try to get, right, some sense of something that's generalizable. But I think that's an excellent point, that the universe in which, right, we're sort of making inference can be faulty, right? Because we can have narrow views of where this data come from.
Yeah. And it's not a fight between disciplines.
No,
It's
no, no,
actually a
that's-
problem of
no.
applying policy within the school or within the
Yes.
city that has real consequences. for policy.
Right. And I'll just, this is something you pointed out earlier, since now we're more embedded in data conversation, is that I think something that emerged and is very nice in our working group is this idea of trying to get away from measuring deficits alone. And that, we started out our questionnaire by asking, what is it that you like about it? And I think too often in urban social theory, we focus on things like social and physical disorder, the extent to which transit isn't very good, the extent to which the schools are not. And we are not measuring the kinds of things that enhance life, the density of social networks, the extent to which family are proximal, some of the other kinds of things that keep people rooted in community. And that translates into high levels of trust and solidarity, which is also something else that we measure. But I think that was an excellent point earlier on in our work and tonight, that we want to be more comprehensive in the kinds of things we're measuring, and to think maybe potentially in a more pro-social frame.
Let me make this one sentence about migration. Since 2020, we've had hundreds of thousands of African Americans leave Chicago. And the population is about what it was in 2000.
Maybe
And
not since 2020, but definitely over.
no,
the
no,
last
I said,
years.
I said from 2000 to 2020, those 20 years,
That's true.
there were hundreds of thousands of African Americans that left the city, but the total population stayed about the same. And what I'm saying is, as wonderful it is, and important it is to think about the Great Migration from the South to the North, especially in the urban context, because they came to the cities. But for decades now, the people or the children of the people who came have been saying, we don't want to stay in these cities. And I think that should be part of the research agenda, is to understand why African Americans are leaving the cities that were their sanctuary when the rural South and the urban South too, but especially the rural South, was just such a horror for them in the first half of the 20th century. And to me, there's great irony in that juxtaposition. And I don't really understand why it's happening, but I think as long as we're going to, think about art that shows movement, we want to think about that more recent movement too. That's all I'm trying to say. I don't have answers. I'm throwing out questions.
Yeah, no, that movement and whether it's movement geographically or movement in terms of, educational pursuits and whatever, it's, my sense coming from the perspective as an artist, I just kind of think that people are driven by narratives. It's like, what stories are they getting that inspire them? So there's some story somewhere out there that is about the South, and maybe that story is that, oh, it's not as recent as it used to be, it is warmer now. Maybe that's, and maybe, I don't know what that, but there's a narrative that goes, along the kind of, whether the data may
But they're
show
not
it.
just going to the South, they're going to the South suburbs here in Chicago. There's just been, to both, there's been especially like Black middle class, don't want to live in the cities in the way they did 50 years ago. There's just been a big movement, and the question is why? And I don't know, but I think you're thinking about migration, you're thinking about movement, you're thinking about space. I just want to throw that into the research agenda.
I think this would be a good one. If you want to jump in, otherwise.
One thing very quickly, which is that there are going to be a lot of empirical, tangible, practical reasons why that's happening. But I come back to the way that you were talking about narrative script. I would imagine that, and this might be an interesting challenge in terms of survey. If you push down on people, one of the things that you're going to say is that I think I actually wanted to make a change in my story. And because of that, I moved to Naperville. Because of that, I moved down to Hammond or Calumet City. Or because of that, I moved to Houston or Atlanta and so on. And that just seizing control of the narrative. There's a point when you spoke initially, and I was thinking you were making these juxtapositions between, empirical narratives and impressionistic narratives and correct narratives and maybe incorrect narratives. Maybe that was inferred more so than said. But there's also value in saying this is my narrative. I'm telling the story rather than waiting for the press or the police or the schools or anybody or the president when it's the first Black president to tell my story for me. I'm telling my story now. And moving, I think both in the beginning of the 20th century and at the beginning of the 21st century is in part about taking control here. Very good. Very good.
So I just wanted to perhaps also in preparation of broadening the conversation to include the audience, but I kind of wanted to draw it back a little bit to the occasion for the gathering, the exhibition. Rick, having worked as a social sculptor pioneer for 30 years, now very invested in painting. The paintings have a somewhat elegiac relationship to the work of the past. You, of course, continue to work in all of these community-driven projects, but the paintings in a way translates. There's a bit of a blues subtext in the painting, in that you kind of look at some of these stories of these deficits and deficiencies and the failings of art as well, right? You're at a point in your life, in your career, in your trajectory, where you wonder to yourself, does art really help? Does it do anything at all? What's the point of all this energy invested in hands-on work in the real world? And kind of retreating into the studio if you want to have kind of slightly more contemplative perspective. And I'm thinking, when you mentioned this story of Charles Barkley touring schools in the South, and he's of course also in Alabama, I believe, right? And he'd go to a predominantly white school and hear this vast range of possibility that kids were able to imagine for themselves. You go to a Black school, predominantly Black school, and hear that 90% would, dream of a future as a basketball player or as a hip hop, as a rapper, basically. And perhaps if Charles Barkley does this today still, perhaps he will hear that some of these kids in the predominantly Black schools also now dream of a future in art or a future in culture. And I just kind of want to, I kind of want to make an observation that we will rejuvenate our confidence in art to really kind of do things and act upon the world. And just yesterday, we've all probably have read or heard of the pseudo scandal of the newest Martin Luther King monument that went up in Boston, offered by Hank Willis Thomas Jr. Yesterday was all over the news. It's on every single news channel, and I don't really watch the news all that attentively, but it was brought to my attention. And it's amazing that all of these news stories never ever mention the artists. Nobody ever talks about the artist, but they do talk about the visual impression. And it's kind of amazing in a way to think that art is a machine for talking, and it's a machine for drawing attention to, certain facts, fictions, And and so in a way, if the question is here, like, how can we move forward? Kind of powered by the ambiguity of a certain kind of catastrophic narrative on the one hand, and an uplifting narrative on the other hand. The way forward is just kind of, still believe in the power of the symbol and representational labor to really empower the sense of possibility that lives in the world, in a community.
No,
And I feel like an evangelist.
And I'm gonna carry that on a little bit, just and give an example of, that's why I say, I mean, that's why I know the power of narratives, and my thing is like, how do we back the narratives up with something that's, that's a little bit that has a kind of research to it that quantify it in a sense. But, when I started with Project Row House, for instance, the narrative about shotgun houses was completely, no one would ever reference a shotgun house in any kind of way that was positive or inspiring at all. But the process of developing that project and engaging with people, even though the data will show that people aren't having fun living in shotgun houses, right? However, the narrative shift in a way where people could see the possibility, they could see beyond, these outcomes of what he's living and look at the aspiration that might be something that is of value for the people who are even living in those circumstances, right? To be able to see themselves living in, shotgun houses in a way that, that is not a trap and something that is suppressing them, but there's some window that they can see shotgun houses being something that is aspirational.
I think this is a place where AV equipment breaking is hard, because I have a hunch that a lot of the room doesn't know what you're talking about. And you have to have actually been in a shotgun house to appreciate the importance of what you're saying.
There's a simple general point, and I Kate and Rick, you both really reinforced it. Start by talking about communities as repositories of assets rather than repositories of problems.
Yeah.
And then begin to think about what the problems are from that fact. But start by thinking about the way in which you're talking about assets. And I think that's hugely important. It's brilliant, but it's also urgently needed.
Yeah.
We do have a little bit of time for questions from the audience. Yes.
Oh, and we got Keon.
This is my question to Rick, but I want to say to the statisticians, like, all the negative things that we talked about, I heard schools and all of that. We can talk about what it means to strip the best and the brightest from and go to a different environment, different resources. We can talk about that later. When I hear about all the stolen cars, I hear about all of your catalytic converters, I'm thinking about a lot of genius stuff. You're thinking about the fact that your car got stolen. And how do you capture that and turn that into something? But Rick, migration of the story has happened all over the world. The people looking for something better. I don't care if we talk about 100 years ago, the Great Migration, what's happening in South America, Africa. But you get a chance to play dominoes with these people and paint some pictures. So tell me about that experience. How is that? What are some of those qualitative and quantitative things you got?
Now, okay, there. Keon's hit the spot there, because that's, to me as an artist practitioner, I don't generally have the luxury of having these great, scholarly minds, known for what they do and respected in all these different parameters, whatever. But I do get those like very wise people that come to the domino table. I mean, Derek, you talked about your family playing dominoes. I mean, it's a game. Games are games, but the games are setting for other things that happen. And all of those things get discussed, and it's one of the reasons why, I'm yearning for a different narrative, because I hear the narrative. And I see the narrative among the people that I meet with, that I talk to in these, informal settings, domino playing or whatever, it's all there, but but trying to find it in a different level. But dominoes, it's like, yeah, and Adam talked about, the process. We call the Black Wall Street Journey project Black Wall Street. We call it journey because it is a process, and we're trying to understand how it moves. Sometimes it moves forward, sometimes it moves back, whatever. And domino game is exact same thing. In fact, in the circles that I play in Houston, they call it the humility table. Because everybody knows, the process doesn't go like this. You don't start playing and just win and win and win and win. You're gonna have some losses, all that kind of stuff, that happens there. And I try to, bring that, into my paintings. The paintings, I mean, you see like they're kind of scuffed up and that kind of stuff. That's about the wear and tear of the process. It's about the struggle, something trying to move in space and time. It's not smooth. Thank you for that.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on Keon's remark, in two respects, with reference to public housing. As a reporter and organizer, I was immersed for the last 10 years of high-rise public housing on South State Street. So lived through the so-called transformation. I think one observation, earlier exchange about public housing in Section 8, putting that aside, is huge numbers of people disappeared into an invisible city. From a hugely visible city, you couldn't go anywhere in Chicago, north, south, east, west, without seeing the high rises in the central city. Although people rarely do that. We were a huge presence. And so in that sense, the Great Migration continues. We have a refugee population. I know people, in particular housing development, I was involved in Stately Gardens, who moved a dozen times with Section 8s and using Section 8s, and some homeless, bouncing in and out of facilities. Point number one. Point number two, going back to the part of the converters, is one thing I'm struck by is we haven't talked at all about the criminal economy, which is a huge part of the local economy on the south side. It's particularly pronounced in public housing. Now, Stateway Gardens, according to the 1990 census, it was the poorest single neighborhood in America. Some sociologists, political scientists looked at census counts and determined this was the single poorest neighborhood. I believe the official unemployment rate was on the order of 90%. But if you were there in the community, everybody was working all the time. Some of that was the drug trade, the biggest single employer, but it was an economy of hustle. Right. It was an economy of hustle. It was the guy who was an informal foodie cat was the woman selling nachos to kids when they came up from school out of their apartment. It was the scrap metal guys who go around in a beat up pickup truck. Now, one of the striking things about the transformation is as the buildings began to come down and private developers took over responsibility for these sites, the first thing that came up was no covenant sites. So the entire kind of local economy was punched. There's a lot of entrepreneurial energy. There's a lot of community cohesion that lives there that we don't value. We don't look for strategies to make some of these enterprises legal. We don't hold up against.
Very good.
Yeah, going back slightly further, two words. I've grown up on the southeast side of Chicago. I graduated Bowen High School in 1968 when the steel mills were just starting to close. Went to college here, then went to Michigan to witness deindustrialization there when I was in law school from 74 to 76. And one big element in your very interesting, demographic of the Great Migration going and then stopping is capital flight. Because the Chicago, Northwest Indiana area lost around 500,000 jobs in the 1960s and 1970s. And that has a lot to do with the collapse of good African-American jobs in unionized factories. I mean, my late father-in-law represented packing house workers, a black-run union that was all stockyards workers. And capital flight happened for two reasons, or went to two different places: abroad and to the south for big manufacturing. And then the stockyards went to Iowa because it was a right to work state. And looking at Englewood now and Detroit, a lot of Detroit now, I don't know how you can replace, because the small businesses need customers. And if there aren't decent wages, who are the customers for those small businesses? So that's just my take. I think we've got to account for those bigger forces even than some of the stuff we've been talking about.
I think we have time for those on the panel to briefly respond. So, yeah.
So I want to follow up, want to agree with Kate and Adam. In every neighborhood in this city, there's somebody running a private school, there's somebody running a charter school, there's somebody running a vocational program for ex-offenders that's doing great work. And most of the success stories that I told you about with, urban schools, charters, there is not white saviors. It's local African Americans finding out a way to run great schools in their neighborhood. The problem that sociologists and demographers and economists confront all the time when they find these things is what's called the scale-up problem. How do you design public policy so that you direct public funds to that activity and then find a way to monitor, maintain, so that as you expand, you keep the quality? And I think I agree with that we should start by looking for the assets. But a question that we all struggle with then is, what's the right set of public policies for replicating the success, or moving it to a larger scale? And I think that's a direct follow-on to your point about let's count the assets first. Once we count them, how do we multiply?
I think, just to quickly add, that getting beyond the demonstration project, because often many of the kinds of things that you're describing are supported through those sorts of efforts, through foundation resources and like, but they aren't cemented in the community, so they don't have the bridge funding to engage in any kind of scale-up. These are some of the disruptions.
And they're subject to predation, either in terms of models being taken and sort of put over in relation to a private model, or, and then you go back to your point, Derek, that monopoly and predation is not only the sin of the private sector, the public sector does it too. And I think that's one of the reasons why you have the informal economy, in terms of thinking about people finding ways to evade, that sort of share that they have to give to the state. One quick fact in relation to this, which I think might be interesting. I was looking at a Brookings Institute study before coming over here. I didn't find the data in terms of Chicago, but I got it nationally. Black businesses are 4% employer businesses. So 96% of Black businesses are single proprietor businesses. That's a lot closer to the informal sector than it is to the model of John Johnson and Jesse Dingo. And that's probably something that's the other thing about how to process that.
But let's in one last thing. let's don't forget the change in the murder rate that happened between the 90s and 2010 after we got rid of the Robert Taylor homes and Stateway Garden. I mean, I agree there's costs and benefits to everything, but we should never forget the murder rates that plagued those communities in the 80s and 90s. And everyone, I believe, my own values, everyone should say never again. We can't live in this city and have 1,000 people die, homicide deaths a year, 90% of them being African. We can't go back to that, whatever we do. And I'm not saying it was the only thing that contributed, but getting rid of having large housing complexes controlled by the gangster disciples, I think was an important step in reducing that rate of homicide. And I think we should have a never again, that we can't have that level of violence. Because the rich people are going to find a way to avoid it. If they got to move out to Naperville, they will. It's the disadvantaged people that end up, getting caught in the crossfire.
Fortunately, we have to stop there. I'm just so excited and hopeful that this conversation will continue over the long run. In the short run, there are refreshments and drinks outside, so I hope you'll stick around and continue talking. Thank you again for coming.
In this chapter, about